Today's topic is getting things right for worm control in sheep and goats. We're very fortunate in that today's speaker is Dr. Gareth Bath. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Pretoria. I could probably talk on the next 5 minutes on his experience and his qualifications. I had a little paragraph up in the chat box before we started conversing. He is a member of our consortium. He's done just about everything to do in South Africa. He's been involved in international projects on parasite control. He's one of the developers of the FAMACHA system, which most of us are familiar with, most of us use. He's also initiated the 5-point check, which he'll talk just a little bit about tonight. But I'm very pleased to have him here. I was fortunate to travel to South Africa last spring, and it's just all the work that South Africa has done to help with parasite control around the world is greatly appreciated. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Dr. Gareth Bath, and I will go ahead and mute my microphone. Dr. Bath?
Thank you, Susan. I'm very glad for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Although we're separated by a big ocean and 2 hemispheres, in fact, in terms of sheep and goats and their parasites, we've got quite a lot in common. And so I hope that you'll find what we found in South Africa useful in your state, wherever it can be in the United States. Big question to start off with is to ask, is there a balance? Whether you love them or loathe them, is there a balance between the sheep and goats and the parasites? And our answer is an emphatic yes, as long as you don't rely on just 1 or 2 things to get the balance right. That is the theme of this presentation today. The other point to make is that for far too long we have concentrated on parasites instead of concentrating on the host, the sheep or goat. They should be our focus, and then we can get places. The problem that we've had, it's worldwide, it isn't just in the United States, is that we all tended to rely on dosing remedies, and these worked previously. They were excellent. I'm talking about since the 1960s. There have been a series of excellent drugs. Unfortunately, this led us to be lazy and to get into bad habits of not thinking of anything else except getting a dosing program. This is reinforced by the companies who had a big sales force out there and pressured farmers into treatments which ultimately were self-destructive. In addition, there was a long lag period between the bad implementation of treatment practices and the problems that arose. 5 years, even 10 years later, it might only emerge on some farms. That leads us to the silver bullet mentality. There's always going to be a new drug for our problem. And that just isn't so, because anthelmintic resistance has become rampant and multiple. In other words, many drugs are no longer effective against the worms that we have. So my plea today is to say that we need to change our attitudes and not just change drugs and hope that there's going to be a new and better one on the horizon. Unfortunately, sustainable and holistic control is complex. There it is, my friends. We are still unrepentant and unrehabilitated drug addicts. Most of us still, eventually, when you think about what we should be doing, we turn to drugs. Like drug addicts, we're addicted. So here's a list of things that we really should try to avoid. First thing is blanket treatments of the entire flock or herd all at once. The only worms that survive that are the resistant ones, and slowly they will become dominant in the worm population. The same is true of frequent treatments. Treatments every 3 or 6 weeks might be wonderful for a while, but it is a potent way to select for anthelmintic or drug resistance. Similarly, we treat our animals in the dry season. Now, I'm in a summer rainfall area, semi-tropical, so that dry season for us is the winter. If we treat our animals in the winter, when most of the most of the worms are in the sheep, then we are much more likely to develop anthelmintic resistance. Coupled with that, the fixed dosing programs that we're so fond of. If I had $1 for each time I'd been asked for a dosing program, I would be quite rich these days. We've got to get away from that and say, we are going to tailor the treatment program according to the requirements of the time. Another thing which we all were advocating many, many years ago was to treat the lot and then move them all immediately onto a new pasture. That was actually, we didn't realize it at the time, but that was actually a way to make great progress in getting the worm population resistant. Another thing that we must avoid at all costs is the estimation of weights. Really, it's worthwhile making sure that when we treat animals, that we treat at the right amount. And that means treating according to the heaviest animals within a group. When I talk about herbs and spices, I mean the ones that are untested and just advocated by hearsay. Where any herbal, as you like to call it, herbal remedy has been proven, and we'll deal with that under Sericea lespedeza, then certainly they could become part of the program. The last one is the unproven and unregistered remedies, which are really those remedies which farmers and other people just concoct. Put this together, put that together, it should be the same, and it isn't. I call that the pharmacologist approach. Be careful of the following: long-acting remedies, and with it combination remedies and ultra-wide spectrum drugs. These cover up the problem often for decades. Long-acting remedies work for a long time. Everybody thinks that they're marvelous. We've got people in this country who advocate low-level treatment through licks or through the water, and they work for a while, but they are a potent way to select for resistance, drug resistance. Combination remedies, the problem there is that although they work, by the time you discover that you've got a problem, you've lost the efficacy of 2 or 3 or more remedy groups all at once. Ultra-wide spectrum drugs, again, you might be wanting to treat for some external parasite, and unwittingly, it's also selecting for resistance in the worms. Generics are those drugs which are similar to the original compound, or supposedly the same as the original compound, but made by a different company. Now, these can be all right. That's why I say it's caution, not avoid. The generics are sometimes come from some very suspicious place in the world and are not really equivalent to the original compounds. Then we think we're being all right, and in fact fails. Beware of specials on sale. These are often short life drugs. In other words, they're nearing their expiry date, or the person selling it to you has got a perverse incentive. In other words, that person has been given a kickback to sell this product. Be sure that you don't fall for that. Using the same remedy continually, some people advocate this. I think that it is also something that we should try to avoid, because if we use the same remedy continually, we certainly are going to run into a resistance problem. Why would I say that caution against the latest and best remedies? These new remedies, which are highly effective, should be our knockout punch and not just the common treatment that we give all the time. This is the one that we keep for emergencies or for quarantine or for other purposes. Finally, be very careful of advice that you get from the seller. Remember, the seller's got a hidden agenda. That person wants to sell you a drug or this or that or the other. If people have got a financial incentive, they might not be giving you the right advice. I'm not saying they never do, but just be careful. Okay, what can you then implement? First of all is holistic sustainable management, the big five, and that is what we are going to spend most of the time on this webinar today. An all-round and all-encompassing approach rather than relying on one or two things. The second point is targeted selective treatment. This means don't treat all the animals unnecessarily. You treat the animals that can and will benefit from the treatment and try to leave some that are untreated so that they retain worms which haven't been selected for resistance. Most of you, if not all, will know about the Pharmachar. The problem is it's only really good for a couple of worms that suck blood. And then we've expanded that to the 5-point check, which encompasses virtually all the worms of sheep anywhere in the world. Next point is then the regular fecal egg counts, the dung counts. If done properly, if analyzed and interpreted properly, these are potent ways of monitoring the situation on your farm. If done badly, they can be badly misleading. So it's important to do them right and to get them properly analyzed by people who know what they're doing. Next bullet point is the periodic fecal egg count reduction tests, and that is the tests that see the test for resistance. In other words, is the drug working? If the egg count does not drop after treatment, then it means that the drug isn't working. And this is important to know so that you can then stop using it and not live in a fool's paradise. The last two bullet points are very important. The selection of rams, the culling of ewes. The selection of rams is really important because your rams, or bucks in the case of goats, are genetically half of your flock. And so you've got to be very fussy that these animals are resistant and resilient to the worms in your area. The ewes, you can't be as picky. You can only cull the worst. So there's a difference between selection, that's the top of your flock or herd, and the culling, that's the bottom. And that's really, really important. If you do that right, I promise you, you will have a far easier way to control the parasites on your farm. Never, ever let animals onto your farm unless they've been quarantined and treated. So when you introduce them, you put them away in an area, not onto a grass, onto an area there where they will not transmit the eggs that they brought in, and then you treat them vigorously. This is actually the subject of quite a long discussion, but just an important point is to make sure that all the animals are properly treated and quarantined and then they're released onto your contaminated pastures so that they pick up your sheep or goat's worms and not the other way around. You must concentrate on lambs and ewes because they are the most vulnerable to the worms, and make sure that at the right times you are really making sure that the worm does not get out of control. Next point is a proper grazing program. It's a pity that this isn't an interactive presentation, because at this point I would say, how many of you have got a proper grazing program? If you're anything like the people in South Africa, quite a lot of people have to admit that they've got no proper grazing program, and that means that they're making a series of ad hoc decisions as to where they're going to move the animals next and for how long, and then we forget where they've been and for how long and how many animals, and that's where we run into trouble. So we've got to have a proper grazing program. The most important point is the next bullet point, long pasture rests. It's really worth emphasizing that the longer the rest, the pasture rests, the less larvae can survive that process. Unfortunately, I can't give you a figure as such. We know that in the tropical regions, it's only a month. Where I am subtropical, it's 2 to 3 months. As we go away from the equator, and I'm now thinking of the northern states of the US, it might be as much as 4 or 5 months. And in the extreme areas up in Norway and so on, it could be even longer. So then it becomes impractical. But there is another thing that we can do, and that's the alternation with completely different grazing animals, like cattle, because they are not susceptible to our worm parasites, and the worm parasites of sheep and goats can't survive in cattle. So they act effectively as vacuum cleaners to clean up the worms on the pasture. Just a word of caution, you cannot alternate sheep and goats because they carry the same parasites. But any other grazing animal, any ruminant will do, other than sheep and goats. Then using the right pastures. SL stands for Sericea lespedeza. It also stands for Smart Man's Lucerne. I hate the name Poor Man's Lucerne because it's misleading and just plain wrong. I don't have any interest in selling Sericea lespedeza, but I know that if I was in an area where it grew, it would be part of my grazing program. And lastly, avoiding the hotspots. Be sure that you avoid hotspots which harbor the worms excessively. What are they? They are the parts of the farm that remain moist and where the animals like to congregate, like around a water trough or a feeding trough, in a marshy area, that sort of thing, or where the animals frequently are put together for treatment. Then, as the animals stand there, they defecate. The feces at a later stage becomes moist enough for the larvae to hatch out. And there you've got a massive, massive amount of infection in the sheep. Just by getting rid of those hot spots, you can do a lot of service to getting the balance between the parasite and the sheep or goat right. Okay, so the solutions that we have had to look for had to be practical, and we in South Africa developed the Pharmachar system not in a fit of virtue or brilliant ideas. we were actually faced with a very serious trouble that none of our drugs were working and the animals simply were dying. And Fafa Malan, after whom it's named, Fafa Malan Chart, Fama Cha, said, well, let's have a look at their eyes and see if we can detect anemia. And that's the way that that worked. And you can see this particular example is dated 2007, actually launched earlier, first version in 2001. So it's been in action for 15 years, and I can tell you without any shadow of a doubt that it's been tested worldwide and it really works. But then farmers said to us, that's all very well for the barber's pole worm, what about the rest? And so we developed the 5-point check, as you can see up there, the logo, 5-point check. Look at 5 points on the sheep. In goats, you only have 4 points to look at. In sheep, you look at the nose for a discharge. That'll tell you if it's worth treating for the nasal botfly larvae. You look at the eye for anemia, as in Famacha, and under the jaw swelling, also for the barber's pole, but also liver fluke and some other of our worms. You check the condition score on the back, and you look at the tail for diarrhea, soiling. I don't know how many of you are able to condition score, but if you can't, then my suggestion to you is it's one of the best things that you'll ever do, quite apart from worm control. The ability to condition score well will determine how your animals are doing nutritionally. We won't be able to discuss this anymore on this webinar, but it's certainly something which could be talked about in the future. This is something that I put up in New Zealand in 2013 about how we are trying to manage internal parasites in sheep in a sustainable and holistic manner. This is starting to also become accepted as a way to approach things. Just a word on holism. The term was actually coined by General or later Field Marshal J.C. Smuts, who started off fighting the British, like the Americans, and ended up fighting with the British, like the Americans. He fought our War of Independence around 1900, and then fought in the First and Second World Wars on the Allied side. He was all sorts of things. He was a prime minister. He was the chancellor of Cambridge University. But amongst other things, he was also a philosopher. And his definition of holism is the tendency in nature to produce wholes from the ordered grouping of units, in his book, 1926. And I'm going to use it in that sense, not a sort of a vague, let's do things nicely together sense. We called it the Big Five, because if you look at all the things that you should and could be doing to get the balance right between your animals and the parasites, it's going to go well over 25. If you challenge me, I'll be able to go up to 40 things that you could do. I don't know if there's anyone listening who thinks that they can easily remember 40 items. It's not easy. Whereas if you break them down into 5 groups, it becomes much easier. That's why we're going to do it now. We're now going to say that if we're going to break them into 25, make sure we don't mix them up. And these are the big 5 put into their compartments. I think you will notice that we're talking about, at the top, the animals, the host, in other words, the worms, the parasites on your left, and then the environment, the pastures. Now, A lot of veterinary students will recognize this straight away as what we call the triad: the animal, the organism, and the environment. And these three work together. In order to understand and to control matters, you've got to know what items will favor the animals and will be against the worms. The last two circles in this illustration are the monitoring of the situation. If we don't measure, we're just going to blunder along until suddenly there's a disaster. And it really is important to monitor effectively and often. Finally, we don't say that you should not treat ever, but we do say that when you treat in the right way and treat the right animals. So let's look at the animals first of all. I'm repeating what I've said earlier, not because I've forgotten, but because it's so important. Select the rams. How can we do that? We select on Famacha, the animal with the reddest eye, with the least anemia. That's my man. Some people say, oh, but you want me to cull my best ram. I say that ram that's pale is not your best ram. It's ruled itself out of contention because it cannot handle the parasites. By the way, I must say to you that in our trials, we found that only 10% of the animals are really giving us trouble. We treat the whole lot as though they were all sick. But if you select rams and you cull ewes, even though the heritability of the trait of worm resistance is only around 25%, that's enough. It's enough to make sure that I can say to you that you will make progress genetically within 3 years, and it'll become very obvious in 5 years that you are getting rid of the rubbish. Coupled with that, though, you must always give the animal a chance to develop an immunity to the worms. That means nutrition. And nutrition is a very big subject. But the most important one of them all is, in fact, protein. Animals that get enough protein can withstand the effect of the worms. And we've seen this clearly in this country, that animals that have got enough protein in their diet are not so much bothered by worms. There are other aspects of nutrition like selenium and zinc, other copper, there are other things that affect the animal's immunity, but they are secondary to the need for proper protein. And then with that, make sure that we look after the animals so that they don't get other diseases, which renders them susceptible to the worms that are on our pastures. Healthy sheep are resistant. And finally, don't be tempted to listen to people who say, don't worry, doc, I dose clean. That's wrong. We've got to have the animals exposed to the parasites so that they can become resistant, resilient to the pastures by means of immunity. So I always start with one because I say if we get that right, we've got a long way towards solving our problems. If I look at this slide, which is taken of impala in our premier game reserve, the Kruger National Park, I'll ask you, who do you think goes around treating these animals for worms? They're often full of worms. How do they cope? Well, the ones that don't cope, what happens to them? Mrs. Lion and Mr. Leopard, take them out, cull them, out they go. So only the animals that can cope with the environment remain. We've got to learn that lesson from nature and not try to do the opposite. So often around the world, people breed an animal and they try to change the environment to suit that animal. I'm saying to you today, rather breed the animal that is suitable for your environment. It does work with regard to worms. There's no research needed. Implement it straight away. Okay, then about the worms. Now we're going to try to make things as uncomfortable as possible for our little worm parasites. First thing is, if you can reduce the length of the stay, remember that those parasites take very often a week or two before the eggs can hatch out and the larvae can get back into the sheep or goats. If you can just decrease that length of stay by having a lot of small camps or paddocks in which you rotate the animals, then they've just got no host in which they can establish again. If it's at all possible, decrease the grazing pressure, in other words, the number of animals per acre in your case, because that will then also reduce the amount of parasites on the grazing. At the same time, increase the time of absence. I've already dealt with that. It's really important that we try to keep our animals away from contaminated pastures until the bulk of the larvae have died out. With that, then, we should also know about the life cycle. I know that life cycle is boring. If I talk about life cycles to veterinary students, I can see their eyes glazing over. But if we understand the life cycle, then we can control it. Hotspots we've talked about. Identify them, either cure them or get rid of them, and you'll be in a better position. And then the last one I've got in this lot is alternation. Make sure that if you've got cattle or ostriches or emus or anything else that you can alternate with your sheep or goats, please use them. And then they will eat each other's worms and clean up your pastures to some extent at least. The pastures themselves know what is good and bad for worms. And take that into account when you plan things on your own pasture. First of all, the type of pasture. In this country, being subtropical to a large extent, we've got a pasture called kikuyu or kaikuyu. It's a wonderful grass, but unfortunately it's also wonderful for the worms because they survive beautifully in the thick mat that it forms. On the other hand, a pasture which grows up away from the ground, the larvae find much more difficult to go up there where they try to get back into the sheep. And here I'm thinking about Sericea lespedeza again. Apart from its other actions, it's not really conducive to the larvae of the worms to climb up and wait for a passing sheep to eat them. That brings me to height. Although we try to utilize our pastures well, remember, the closer that animals graze to the ground, the more likely it is that they will pick up more and more parasites. So if you are forced to graze with animals, the pastures by animals close to the ground, you're going to get into trouble because they will then be eating a mouthful of worms at each bite. Remember also the other things which can affect the infectivity of the pasture. First of all, the slope of the land. If you've got flat, marshy land, the water tends to accumulate there, and that's very happy news for the worms, bad news for your sheep. With that, the soil type. Thick clay soils retain moisture and therefore are much more favorable for the worms. aspect. In other words, whether the pasture is north or south facing is important. In the northern hemisphere, the south facing slopes will be hotter from the sun and therefore drier and therefore less dangerous than the north facing slopes. In the southern hemisphere, it's the other way around. Finally, then, irrigation. Good for the pasture, but unfortunately also good for the worms. So when we've got an irrigated pasture situation, we have to up our game. And finally, fertilization. I'm not advocating that we don't fertilize our pastures. I'm just saying that if they are fertilized, they are much more attractive to the sheep and goats, and therefore they're going to eat more, and it's more resilient to drought, and so that increases the risk of parasitism. So be aware of that. These are three huge items that have to be considered if you're going to have a holistic and sustainable system. Okay, here's my Smart Man's Lucerne trial of a few years ago. The blue columns illustrate Sericea lespedeza only, the yellow a combination, and the green natural pastures, which we call felt only. Notice that the blue columns are nearly always the lowest. They are either the lowest or close to it, and that the natural pasture, the fecal egg count, is the highest. This is in spite of the fact that the number of sheep per surface area, in our case then it was hectares, number of sheep was actually much higher for the Sericea lespedeza group than for the natural grazing. And if you look at the bottom there, it means that far less worms were getting onto the pasture as a result of grazing Sericea, apart from its other benefits. It's full of protein, good quality protein, and when the sheep do eat it, they're not eating a mouthful of worms at the same time. How many animals were treated? There it is. You can see that in the top line, where they only grazed Sericea, more than half of them, they needed no treatment whatsoever. Once, only 8, 36%. Just one needed 2 treatments and none needed 3. Whereas in the mixed grazing, 52% and 40% and 8% respectively for the same categories. Whereas where they were fed natural grazing only, look what happened. Only 14% escaped the need to be treated. More than half of them had to be treated once, 23% twice, and nearly 5% had to be treated 3 times. And that was in spite of the fact that there were far less animals per hectare on the natural grazing. So the message is, believe Tom Terrell and the other people who advocate Sericea lespedeza. It works. We've got a farmer in our country who's up to 700 hectares. That's over 1,500 acres that he's got. Just one farmer, because it's such a good pasture. Then we come to, near the end, the monitoring. If we don't measure, we have got no clue as to what's going on. So part of a holistic program is that you must measure. First of all, the fecal egg counts, they have to be regular, especially in the season where parasites are prevalent. Where I am in a summer rainfall, quite warm area, pretty much useless to take fecal egg counts in the winter because the parasites are not active. It's just too dry. Whereas in other parts, down towards Cape Town, which is winter rainfall, then you have to do your fecal egg counts mainly in the winter. Any of you will have this similar situation. Also, you must monitor by TST results, targeted selective treatment results. I'll show you how that works for pharmacare. It works for all the other ways of doing targeted selective treatment as well, so that you can monitor and see, is the position getting worse or better, or is it stable? Test for efficacy to monitor whether your drugs are still working. At least every 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, and you can go down to every second year. When you treat at a bad time, just follow up the second check 10 days later, and you'll see, well, how much percentage of efficacy is that particular remedy giving you. At the same time, you've got to monitor the weather. When the weather's right for the worms, also right for the pastures, it's the right time for you to get in there and check and see that whether the animals need treatment, or do they need transfer to a new pasture, or what do we need to do. That means also that you've got to check the grazing. If the animals are in badly eaten down pasture, maybe it's time for a new pasture. And then finally, there are some tests. I know that there are tests available. We find that they're a bit difficult to work here, and we find that farmers are not really implementing them because they're too cumbersome. You do the test now and you only get the result in a few days' time. All the things that we've been advocating today is about the effective monitoring in the farmer's hands. That's the criteria by which we decide on whether we're successful or not. Can the remedy that we've suggested work in the farmer's hands? So there it is. There's an example of what happens in our own flock at Onderstepoort, where we test all the animals, and 80% of them are category 1, in other words, red eyes. I know that the risk is negligible. I've measured it, and I don't have to worry. If it goes down to about 60%, it's still extremely small. The chance of any wheels falling off is still very small. And then the next stage with a moderate risk is when you see your first category 3 pharmacare tests, because this indicates that some of the animals are on the edge. They could go into decompensation, illustrated by the 4th bar chart there, where you can see that we've now got category 4, the red one, which is indicating these animals are in trouble. They are down to a third or half of their normal anemia score, and therefore they're in trouble. And by the time you get to category 5, these animals are in imminent danger of dying. So this was a simple way, just by using the pharmacare, that you can work out how things are going. And a similar sort of thing can be done for the other parasites. Now, when it comes to the remedies, remember to use targeted selective treatment, treat the animals that will benefit, weigh them, and dose according to the heaviest in the group. Read the label. Sometimes people just go ahead and they make a terrible mistake, and we find it over and over here that it's not as recommended, and then you actually lose sheep. You target the weakest, those animals that we talked about, the heavily pregnant and lactating ewes, and the lambs. For heaven's sake, don't buy on cost, because sometimes you get more than you bargained for. And finally, beware of those untested products. If they've been tested, then you're okay. But if people just say to you, well, I found it very effective, it hasn't been scientifically tested, you could be just buying a hope and a promise, not something that will help you. Okay, so this is just an illustration of what the problem that our farmers face in this country. They go into the so-called co-ops, cooperatives. They're just faced with a wall of options. And guess what they do? I ask them, how do you select it? And they look a bit sheepish and smile. And they say, well, we go on price. Cheapest isn't always best. Neither is most expensive. You've got to use the remedy for the situation. And that's where our 5-point check comes in, because apart from identifying the animals, we've added how you can decide which parasites they probably are and which drugs would be most suitable. So the 5-point check is something which I would say is well worth anyone in North America trying. It does work. Okay, so we're now going to summarize then that when we want to do effective worm control, we use those 5 points. And what I'm saying to you also in this closing session is that you don't have to try to do all 25 or 28 all at the same time. What you can do is that you can say, I'm going to try and do 1 or 2 items from each one and try and get those right, and then move on to the rest. And eventually then you get to that balance that we're looking for at the beginning, the balance between the worm, the sheep, the environment, and indeed you, who are the people, who are the farmers. It does work, and I hope that you will all find what I've been saying useful. Mottos to remember. I like mottos because they encapsulate what I've been saying. Stop selecting sissy sheep. We keep on selecting animals because they're this and they're that, and they've got a lovely this and that, and we forget that the sheep that cannot cope with parasites is not a suitable sheep. Next motto is, when you're treating, leave the best, the ones that are unlikely to benefit from what you're doing, and then treat the rest. It's as simple as that. And always look before you treat. Don't just treat blindly and the whole lot. 4th bullet point, mindful managers must measure. We've been through that. If you check the animals, measure, make a note, you know where you are. 5th bullet point, for heaven's sake, don't go to the pharmacologists for advice and say, oh, well, if you mix this and that, you get more or less the same thing. Make sure that you use the right product when you do use it. Finally then, although drugs are important, the solution isn't always found in a bottle. Yes, thank you in 7 of our 11 official languages, and I hope that you found this presentation of use.
Okay, Dr. Bath, we've got an assortment of questions that I'm going to start asking. Okay, the first question seem to be echoing.
Okay, that's for the parasite becoming resistant to SL. Is that the one, Alan Sparks?
So,
is that the one?
I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions.
Okay, right.
The first question was, the person wanted to know if they understood correctly that a northern climate needs a longer rest period.
Yes, the further north you go in the northern hemisphere, the longer the withdrawal period has to be. Yes.
Okay, the next question was, which of the 5 points may not be relevant to goats?
Definitely the check on the nose, because although it has been recorded that goats can get the nasal botworm, it's extremely rare and it's not worth bothering about. So that's the one to leave out in goats.
Okay, another question about the 5-point check is if you could explain a little bit more about the nose. I think here it's related to sheep, and the back. How do you evaluate those 2 points? What do you look for?
Right, the nose, we're looking for discharge. Now, discharge can be due to other things, but if it's a fairly clear discharge that's found in a number of sheep that are otherwise looking quite healthy, it's unlikely to be pneumonia. It's much more likely to be nasal worms, and especially because the little worms are climbing around in the sinuses of the sheep, they often sneeze and snort, and out comes a whole lot of mucus. So the point is that the animals that are showing nasal discharge and discomfort, treat those ones. But there'll always be some that aren't showing it, so we don't treat them, so that the remedy that we're using is less likely to become ineffective against the nasal bots.
Okay, you were talking about the importance of protein. We have a participant that wants to know, what is the protein requirements for dairy goats? She's read that anything above 14% is too high.
Okay, you're going to ask me for a generalization here, because it depends on where she is in her lactation cycle. The greatest percentage is required in the early part of lactation, and then you could touch up to 14%, even 16%, but that's going over the top. 16% is really what we reserve for kids and lambs. As a very general guideline, I say to people that a dry animal with no other requirements needs at least 8% protein. Most animals will not need more than 12%, even if they're lactating. But dairy goats are a special case, and we might be able to justify up to 14% in some cases. I hope that puts the situation clearly. By the way, our friend Serratia lespedeza is more protein than that. And so that's what makes it so good. There's plenty of protein. And the other thing is, it's quality protein, not just nitrogen. It's good quality protein.
We have a question about alternating species, and they want some advice. Would you rest the pasture and then put cattle in, or do you remove the sheep when there still is good grass height? So how would you recommend a program where you're utilizing both sheep and cattle in a pasture rotation?
Okay, we've got to remember that the cattle cannot eat very short grass effectively. So what you do is you put the sheep in. It shouldn't be more than the height of your calf when you walk in the grass, because sheep don't like long grass. So it should be somewhere between ankle height and calf height. And then you graze it down intensively by the sheep, and then it can go right down to below ankle height, just a couple of fingers height. Then you take out the sheep or goats, and then you have to let it grow again, because you've got to think about the pasture, not only the worms. You then let it grow back again. Now, cattle are much happier with a taller grass, so that you could let it grow out to a calf height or even knee height for the cattle to eat. The nice thing then is that it's given your grass a good rest and time to grow out, and then you put in the cattle, and don't graze it right down this time. Graze it down to about between calf height and ankle height, and then put the sheep in again, or the goats.
Okay, we have a question. Does birth Okay, we have a question. Does Burnsford trefoil have the same action as Sericea lespedeza?
I do not claim to be an expert on Burnsford trefoil, but I suspect not, because it doesn't have a magic ingredient that Sericea lespedeza has, and that is condensed tannins. If I'm wrong, then maybe it does have that effect, but as far as I know, although all plants will have a certain degree of tannin, it's not at the level that we require. But Burnsford trefoil is very good in other ways. It's a fabulously good protein, and being a legume, it's also not conducive to those worms to crawl up the stems and get back into the sheep.
Okay, I have a question about doing faecals. This person wants to know, do you need to do faecals on all the stock, regardless of the Fromacia scores? She says that's a huge amount of time. Can you do a smaller selection? If so, how do you go about selecting using
Okay, we've
fecal
got
egg
to
counts?
remember that the animals that we're trying to monitor are not all the same. So the first bit of advice I'd say is check the young animals, the pregnant or lactating ewes, and the rest of the animals separately. So that is very important to do that. So the thing is that you have to do them separately. And then the important point is to remember is that we're trying to get a group picture. So if you take the very worst animals, then you're going to get the worst case scenario. If you take the average, then you're getting an average. So what I say is that if you, depending on what you want to discover, you take between 10 and 20 samples. Now, this is something that we have shown works in this country. It saves you a lot of time, effort, and money. You take between 10 and 20 animals, irrespective of the size of the group that you're monitoring. But you take the same amount from each of the animals. That you can do quite easily by squeezing it into a spoon or something like that. So you're getting the same amount, and then you pool that as a single sample. And then you can get a fecal egg count of the best animals, the medium animals, and the small animals. Now you've turned the sampling into only 3 or a couple of samples. And then you can get a good idea. But watch out for one thing, and that is that different worms have a different egg-laying capacity. So if you're up in Vermont or Maine or one of those places, there's a problem for you in that our normal ways of measuring things for wireworm or barber's pole won't work. Ducked out there for a while. Sorry, we're back again. Okay, so that would be my big plea to you, is make sure that you know which are your worms. Is it the brown stomach worm, Ostatagia teladorsagia? Is it bankrupt worm, as we call them here, the Trichostrongylus? Is it barber's pole and Monchus contortus? Because we've got to evaluate those numbers differently. In Monchus, for instance, any count less than 5,000 is not one that we get too worried about here. Whereas if you get an egg count above 1,000 or 2,000 with these other worms, you're in serious trouble. So I'm afraid it's not simple. That's why I say if you're going to do them, you must make sure that the result is analyzed properly. But quite frankly, I would never advocate single samples. It's too time consuming, and you get the same result anyway, because you're going to take the 5 or 10 animals that you've sampled individually and you're going to average the result. So I average it by putting the samples together, and we've shown that it works.
Is it reliable if a producer does their own fecal samples? Is it reliable if a producer does their own fecal samples?
Yes, but they must not take shortcuts and think, oh, well, I'll do it in my way. The ways that have been worked out have been by long scientific trials, and you've just got to do it right, do it according to the instructions, and then make sure that you know which worms you're dealing with. That can be done in two ways. The one is to get, when animals are slaughtered, take the guts into somebody, a parasitologist, who can say, well, these are the worms present, or you take a fecal sample and they hatch them out. And the experts, I've said, the experts can tell the difference between the different larvae. Most of us, and that includes me, can't do it reliably. I rely on experts to give me the result.
Another question related to fecal egg counts. This particular question came from the Northeast. But is there an Another question related to fecal egg counts. This particular question came from the Northeast. But is there an optimal
answer
time
to the
for
second question is yes.
counts?
I know
is there
one
a kit that you can buy?
that is produced by the New Zealanders, and for the life of me now, I can't remember. Oh, it's called FECPAC, FECPAC. It gives you everything and instructions. So that would be the one. If you want to do it yourself, you can get that kit. The first part of the question was when to monitor. The most important time to monitor is when the worms are active. We know that the Monchus contortus is a summer-loving parasite. So in this part of the world, I don't even bother to recommend anything in our winter period, because we're going to find either nothing or negligible counts. As soon as I go into our winter rainfall area, then it turns around, and it has to be late autumn, winter, and early spring. And the other point that the person who posed the question can remember is that time of the farm activity that I reckon is really important is as the ewes are approaching lambing or kidding, in the case of does, and then after they've kidded or lambed, and then again those lambs. Keep an eye on the lambs, because the things can get out of control with lambs and kids. That's when I would advocate doing fecal egg counts. But if you do the other check, the 5-point check and the fecal egg count reduction test, then you know where you are.
Speaking of ewes lambing and does kidding, it's a common recommendation here. Speaking of ewes lambing and does kidding, it's a common recommendation
Susan, I don't
to treat them before or shortly after lambing and kidding.
Yes, depending on the pasture that they go on to. That's why you can't just answer those questions in isolation. If they are going to go on, which I would advocate from a nutritional point of view, if they're going to go on to a new pasture more or less at the time of lambing and kidding, and they're going on to a fresh, relatively safe pasture, then you can do that. But if you haven't got any pastures that are clean, they're all risky, then you might have to treat them. So we're not saying never treat them all. We're saying that if you treat them all, you must then make sure that the animals do not go straight onto a clean pasture, because now you're selecting for resistance. But there are cases where you've just got no option, you've got to treat them all. All that we are saying is keep that to the absolute minimum.
questions about the optimum grazing height.
Okay.
There is a couple of questions about the
Let's talk
optimum
about
grazing height.
from 3 points of view, because we have to accept that there's no simple answer to that question. From the point of view of what the sheep and goats enjoy, it's almost a question of the shorter the better. They like short grazing. They don't like calf-high grazing and higher. It's not their scene. You'll see that if they're in a pasture like that, they'll be eating at the bottom anyway by preference. But somewhere between calf height and ankle height is when to put where you could put the animals into the pasture and get them out before it looks more like a lawn than a pasture. From the point of view of the pasture itself also, you must remember that if we don't ever give the pasture time to grow out, to recover, to photosynthesize, we're going to eventually ruin the pasture. So we do need that rest from that point of view. And then from the worm's point of view, of course, they like it as short as possible and as dense as possible, and then the maximum number of the larvae survive. And that's where we've got to obviate that problem by making sure that we are attacking that grazing quite aggressively and then getting out before there are too many larvae that have hatched and are getting back into the animals.
There's a question about the importance of pasture rotation. If your stock rates are really low, and the example there is a question about the importance of pasture rotation. Acres. If your stocking rates are really low, and the example this person gave was about 20 does and their kids on about 30 acres.
What's the rainfall in that area?
Included
Could you give me some idea there?
Is it important to rotate under those circumstances? It was in Maine, and if she could comment, I would.
So that would be. Okay, so for. I think Maine being a cooler climate, that's quite a lot of rain. That means that the parasites are in happy street because there's a lot of survival ability because they're moist and they're protected. Many of them will survive. So I would say generally though that because the stocking rate or the grazing pressure is low, that you're going to have a lot less risk. But you could make it even lower by cutting that paddock up. How big did we say it was? How many acres? 30. Okay. So what I'm trying to put to you, and I'm not trying to be clever from 12,000 kilometers away, is that if we were to cut that up into 6 paddocks, then it means that we could rotate, say, in groups of, in times of about 2 weeks each. And by the time we get around to the number 1 again, we are many weeks later, and there's far less chance of huge numbers of parasites surviving, although there will always be some.
Sericea lespedeza. Is the parasites to become resistant to Sericea lespedeza if it's fed in combination with natural forage? I have a question about Sericea lespedeza.
Is that nature is always on the go.
Resistant to Sericea lespedeza,
organisms are in a fight for survival, and that includes the worms. And so, yes, we will get a degree of resilience in the worms if they have to cope with that Sericea lespedeza. And that's why I'm advocating that we must be very mindful and encourage the development of resistance and resilience in the sheep and goats. because then you get that balance that I started the talk out with. The balance between the worm, the host, and the environment.
There are situations or places in the U.S. where we can't grow Sericea lespedeza. We had a speaker ask, or a person asking about the Sericea lespedeza pellets. There are situations or places in the U.S. where we can't grow Sericea lespedeza.
I don't have that knowledge.
We had a speaker ask,
the
or a
guys
person
who've done most work are Tom Terrell and company.
Pellets, how much you would
we
give,
don't advocate,
I guess, on pasture.
Pellets in this country because we've got other ways of dealing with our problem. Our problem is, in fact, that we don't have decent food for our animals in the winter. And so we have to plant pastures like alfalfa and Sericea lespedeza, cut them, bale them, and then they're there for the winter. So we don't actually do the pelleting, and I can't answer that question.
As I mentioned, last week's webinar was on Sericea lespedeza. If you have any specific questions on that, I would certainly encourage you to email Tom Terrell. As I mentioned, last week's webinar was on Sericea lespedeza. If you have any specific questions on that, I would certainly encourage you to email Tom Terrell, and maybe even watch the webinar from last week. Trying to see if there's some more questions I might have mixed.
You say Wormex.
Somebody was asking about a product called VRM from the UK. Have you heard of that product? Are you familiar with it? VRMX.
Okay. I'm afraid that's a commercial name. And
VRM, V as in Victor.
I don't know what it contains.
VRMX.
All the products have got commercial names, and if you don't know what's in them, then you can't comment. But I would say that in small type somewhere, it must tell you what it contains. And then if you can give somebody the name of the active ingredient, then we can comment. But once again, I say, yes, we must use drugs as part of our program, but that shouldn't be our focus. The focus must be on getting sheep and goats right, getting the pastures right, and getting the worms all wrong.
I did a quick Google search on it. It's promoted as an herbal dewormer.
Okay. Look, I'm not against it.
I did a quick Google search on it. It's
totally against herbal dewormers because, after all, I can give you a good argument that Sericea lespedeza is an herbal dewormer. So if it's been tested as thoroughly as SL and shown how it works by the various groups in America, I'm quite happy to advocate it. In fact, I do. In this country, I say Sericea lespedeza, or what I call smart man's lucerne, is definitely part of the solution for most farms in the higher rainfall areas of South Africa. If you go to the drier parts, our equivalent of, say, Texas and New Mexico, it's just too dry for that plant to flourish, and then we've got to think of something else.
Somebody asked a question about stocking rates in the Midwest, and I know that answer is very difficult. Make a comment on how people. Somebody asked a question about stocking rates in the Midwest, and I know that.
Okay, we're talking about natural pasture or planted pasture.
Make a comment on how people might determine what might be the appropriate stocking rates on their farm, kind of in a general way. Planted, cultivated pasture.
Okay, if we're talking about cultivated pastures, then we can work it out relatively easily.
I would say for
here's the thing that anybody can do on their farm and discover what is the carrying capacity of my pasture. If it is an even single species, or then a few different ones, but it's relatively even. Now what you need to do is to make yourselves a little triangle. In this country we use hectares. So what I tell farmers to do is to make a little triangle, 1 meter by 1 meter. That's the square part, and the hypotenuse just connects up those things. That gives you a half a square meter, and then we just throw that down in different parts of the pasture after it's grown out for a while, cut off the growth, and then you can work it out because there are 10,000 square meters in a hectare. Once you've dried it, you know what the dry matter production per hectare is. But there's another way you can do it if you want to know what's going on your farm, and that's to have what we have an exclusion cage. Now, I can't work this out in acres, but in our system, we've got hectares. I would then make a little cage of not exactly a meter by a meter square cage, and that's because it's got a fine mesh wire around it. No goat can get in there. And you leave it there, and then during the year, you lift it, you cut off all the grass or the pasture that's in there, dry it, and then work out what the amount of pasture is per year per hectare. And that'll be in what we do is we say tons per hectare because kilograms doesn't help you. Now, here comes the point. For each sheep, the ewe and her lamb, or the doe and her offspring, of a reasonable size, we're talking about 60 kilograms. I don't know what that is in pounds anymore. I used to know. 60, 65 kilograms. Each one of those units, the mother and their offspring, needs about 1.5 tons of good quality roughage per year. You can go and work it out yourself. I've worked it out a number of ways, and that's more or less your guideline. So now, if, for instance, your pasture is yielding 8 tons or 9 tons per hectare, then we know that year-round it'll only carry 6 sheep. 6 sheep. It'll carry 6 sheep through the year. But then you can say, all right, I'm only going to utilize that for 6 months. Now it can carry 12. See how you do it? And then you can work it out from there. And then you can also do a fodder flow and say, well, this lot of pasture is ready at this time, and that lot at another time. And then you can actually work out that you've got enough food for your animals throughout the year. It's quite a complex thing, but it can be done on that basis. If, however, you've got natural grazing and you don't know what they're eating because they've got a choice of 20 or 30 pasture species, you have to do it in a more of a reckoned a thumb rule way, and that is you've got to see how many animals you can carry per hectare in the average year without them going backwards. That becomes very difficult because we all know that some years it's good, some years it's bad, and you're going to find it difficult. What we've got, in fact, in our country is that over the years for different parts of our natural grazing parts, and that's maybe 80% of our country, the people worked out the carrying capacity year on year. And then we know that because that's the average kind of carrying capacity, in certain years we're going to have to feed them. In some years we'll have excess. That's the way it has to be because our rainfall is not dependable. I hope that helps the question.
I have a producer asking about selecting a ram from his own breeding stock. It's very difficult to find a male that has some resistance to parasites. We have a producer asking about selecting a ram from his own breeding stock. It's very difficult
to
yes, you find a male that has some
but once again, there's a but to it. the smaller the size of your flock,
and how would you go about
the
that?
greater the chance of inbreeding. Inbreeding in itself is not necessarily dangerous, but it can bring out unexpected and unwanted traits. So you must be aware of that. But yes, we've got lots of farmers who've got large flocks. By that I mean 1,000 and more animals. And most of the time, they simply select their own animals. So we've got systems here where we make sure that we don't select those sissies. In other words, the animals mustn't be raised in the barn. They have to be raised out in the pasture where they and their offspring have got to perform. And then you check for growth rate, if they're wool sheep, for the main wool characteristics, and whether they were one of a twin is important, because twinning is partly heritable. So we like to see that there's a history of twinning in that ram's mother, grandparents, and so on. And then we check the animals not only for their weight and their ability to put on weight, but for other things that may be important, like their hoof conformation, because if you're in an area where it's very wet and you have a lot of foot rot or foot abscess, then you need to have animals with good hooves. And then you've got to select for that as well. But on top of that, as far as parasites go, you can look at all the animals every time you do the weighing and score them. You only select from those that have got the top scores. The Famacha 1 and even the strong ones. So in other words, they are right at the top of the scale. Those are the ones to go for. The other way to do it, if you're not bothered by Barber's pearl worm, is to do fecal egg counts on the individual rams at some stage. And the ones that are producing the most eggs, out they go. Ones that are producing the least eggs, they're in. Then you select from them. Okay, so that's how you can do it.
We have a producer from Maine, again up in the north. She has a small farm. The animals aren't grazing. Is there anything she really do to keep internal parasites at bay? We have a producer from Maine, again up in the north. She has a small farm. The animals aren't grazing.
The answer is probably not.
To keep
almost certainly not.
She cleans out, keeps the pens clean
for internal parasites. The reason is that she will find that there is just not enough parasites. Even on a little bit of hay, they might have survived. There'll be so few of them, it's not worth worrying about.
The 5-point check. Can you use this system to evaluate animals for coccidiosis? Does it apply to coccidiosis? The 5-point check. Can you use this system to evaluate animals for coccidiosis? Does it apply to coccidiosis?
Yes, to a degree. The animals that are worst affected could be the ones that you want to select against. In other words, cull them preferentially if you can. And the animals that are least affected would be the ones that you would want to keep. But if you're talking about the need for treatment, be very careful with coccidiosis. The animals actually die very often of dehydration. That's what I've found. So if you don't get in there and treat them and give them electrolyte support therapy, you're going to lose the animal just simply from dehydration. We haven't done work on it. The answer is that I cannot say for sure, but as a principle, I would expect that if we try to identify the weaklings regarding coccidiosis and get them out of our flocks, and then rather select and work with the ones that didn't need as much treatment, we're on the right path.
the 5-point check to make treatment decisions?
For coccidiosis, thank you, I forgot about that. The main effects of coccidiosis would be on
Can we use the 5-point check
diarrhea.
to make treatment
yes,
decisions?
That part, the check number 5, the animals with the most watery fluid diarrhea and the ones that are dehydrated. Now you'd have to bring in a new test, the dehydration test. If you go to the animal's head and take the skin just below the eye between your thumb and forefinger, and pull it away, and then release it, it should spring back straight away. As soon as the skin stays up and then gradually goes back, you know that that animal's dehydrated. You must get in there and treat, and remember to treat for the dehydration, the electrolytes, as well as the fluid. But as far as coccidiosis is concerned, yes, they will eventually lose condition score. That's on the top line of the back. But, by that time, the worst is over. There will be no effect on the anemia score, the FOMACHA, and they also will not develop a bottle jaw under the fluid under the jaw. And, of course, nothing with the nose. So it's not particularly useful for coccidiosis, but you could use the DAG score or the diarrhea score, and then on top of that, the dehydration score by picking up the skin under the eye and just seeing if it springs back straight away or not.
And for those who participated last week, there is evidence that Sericea lespedeza is effective also against coccidia. And for those who participated last week, there is compelling evidence that Sericea lespedeza is effective also against coccidia. I think we've exhausted all the questions. If I've missed one, could somebody type it in the chat box real quick? Otherwise, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Bath. I'm sure he's getting hungry. Again, it's been a real pleasure to have one of the world's experts as one of our speakers. So, again, I want to thank him for participating. Again, I'm sure he's getting hungry for dinner now because I guess it's about 5:30 in South Africa. It's always nice to get a perspective that's different. So, again, I want to thank him for participating. I'm glad that our technology works. We have a few glitches the last few days. And it's always nice to get a perspective that's different from the U.S. And yet at the same time, you know
I'd like to just
how
say
much
thank you to all of you for listening, and happy farming.